Hey, hey, hey! Welcome to my cozy corner of the internet. This is Nephilim VA bringing you the 43rd chapter of Inheritance, written by A is for Amy 71 on AO3. It's been a little while, but we are back with another chapter of Inheritance. Where were we? Oh yes, Stain was dealt with. What will happen next? Let's find out after the trigger warnings. This fanfiction is for mature audiences with canon-typical violence and a trigger warning for major character death. If that isn't your style, then I recommend Shades of Green, which is written by Maybe It's Friendly on AO3. It can be found on my channel. Canon Divergence is the name of the game and indulges the what-ifs of Midoriya Izuku having a quirk. With that being said, the chapter summary is as followed. Stain was apprehended, but they still need to get out of Hosu. Now I implore you to sit back and relax whilst I read to you. Chapter 43. It took a few minutes for Izuku to stop shivering. He walked a little behind and a little to the side of Endeavour for the warmth he emitted, but it was also a warm night and his skin was no longer feeling as if it was being bitten by fire ants all over his body. His teeth still chattered every few seconds, and he was sure his lips were probably blue, but he was returning to a normal temperature. Besides, Endeavour was dragging Stain behind him by the back of the villain's shirt, and Izuku didn't want to be anywhere near that. Native and Onuma, who had been standing at the mouth of the alley to keep watch, supported Ida, whose arm and shoulder were injured, along with his leg, which had been stabbed at least once somewhere along the line. Shoto had a wrapped forearm on his right side, but he waved away Izuku's concern when asked about it. Torchlight had a slice across his chest, but it wasn't deep enough for stitches, and had merely bled a lot. They had all been very, very lucky. There were a lot fewer people on the street than there had been, and Izuku wondered exactly how long they'd been in that alley, from the time Izuku had dropped in to now. There was still a lot going on around the town, as evidenced by the smoke rising up from place to place and the sirens from emergency vehicles. What happened to Stain? Did we hit him that hard? Izuku asked Shoto, who was walking next to him. He was still conscious while we were in the ice. He's sedated, Shoto told him, glancing at the form being dragged. Native had a blow-dart tranquilizer in his kit. I melted a hole to his leg, and we knocked him out. Sorry it took so long. Izuku shrugged. He had honestly thought that they were all done for. Being encapsulated in ice for a while seemed a small price to pay. Speaking of price to pay, Izuku turned and looked at Ida, who had been weeping quietly since everything was resolved. His face was a mottled red and tears and snot ran freely. He kept murmuring apologies and self-deprecating remarks to himself, his brother, and to Izuku and Shoto. Ida, what can we do for you? Izuku asked him, pausing to let the men supporting Ida catch up. You're in the worst shape of all of us. I don't deserve your pity or your help, Ida told him with a sniffle. I'm the one who should have been helping with the Nomus or the evacuation, but I was blinded. He pulled his arms free of the two men with a wince of pain, and stood on his own to bow at the waist in a stiff, perfect 90-degree angle. I beg you to forgive me for putting you in such grave danger. I have no excuse. Yeah, Shoto said evenly. That was pretty stupid. You shouldn't do that again. Izuku had an inappropriate urge to laugh at Shoto's calm remark, but what more could anyone really say at this moment? It was clear that Ida understood the gravity of everything that had just happened, and was busy punishing himself mentally. What would happen to him later when he had to face legal ramifications and his mentor were also probably going to be pretty harsh. Izuku understood what had driven Ida to behave the way he had, and couldn't judge him for something he might have also tried to do if he was put in a similar situation. Endeavor was barking into a phone that he had the hero killer in custody and needed transport for him immediately. And there was a paramedic truck visible about a block away that they seemed to be headed towards. Izuku breathed a sigh of relief as their group made their way to safety, and he hoped they would soon be heading back to the agency where Izuku intended to take a hot, hour-long shower and sleep for as long as they would allow. He paused then, remembering the message he'd sent to Sir and All Might. Endeavor had said they'd contacted him. He pulled out his phone to let them know he was safe, doubting that anyone had thought to do it either. Everyone kept trudging on, though Shoto stopped when he noticed Izuku wasn't keeping up. Izuku flicked his phone screen on and opened his messaging app. Then the world fell away from under him. It was a strange sensation to feel strong bands around his left arm, as he watched his group get smaller and further away by the second. His brain couldn't pass what was happening, until he twisted enough to see that the winged Nomu had a hold of him and was carrying him away, flapping its leathery wings. It was not a smooth ride, as spouts of flame rushed past that had the creature swerving and screeching in protest. Endeavor looked livid as he shot into the air after them, using his flames as jet fuel to give him lift. What was he thinking? Unless he had some serious precision, he could easily cook Izuku in his attempt to take down the monster. Was he banking on the fact that Izuku hadn't really been injured by his flashfire when they trained? That was a risky assumption at best. Izuku engaged his levitation to try to alleviate the strain on his arm, which was burning from being jerked around with all of his weight hanging on it. The Nomu flew even higher in his attempt to get away from the flames, and Izuku's levitation made that escape easier. The flame hero was unable to keep up, or realize the danger of further attacking while the monster was holding Izuku like that. Izuku gripped the talons holding him in their tight grip and swung and kicked upward, trying to make contact with the thing's legs, releasing his levitation quirk to make himself heavier. When that didn't work, he used One for All to increase his grip strength and peeled the toes from around his arm, probably breaking the bones and leaving Izuku dangling from the creature's ankles. Then he let go. The drop was terrifying, but Izuku knew it was his best chance. The Nomu turned and dove toward him, but Izuku straightened his body to fall faster. The Nomu did the same, and it didn't take long before Izuku was smacked to the side and pinned to the wall of a skyscraper by the talons he'd just freed himself from. He used as much strength as he could muster, and punched the Nomu in the chest, then slammed down his fist on its legs. It dropped Izuku then, and he had just enough time as he began to tumble downwards to push himself off the face of the building into free air. The Nomu was flapping around, circling in his descent, trying to angle so it could grab its prey from behind with its hands, its legs now injured. Izuku kept an eye on the ground and let himself continue to fall. It wasn't until he could make out the features on the faces of the people below that he began to levitate. It took several meters before he slowed, and even more before he stopped and began to rise again. The Nomu caught up with him, but before it could make a grab for him, a thin pillar of flame shot up from below and wrapped itself around one of the Nomu's wings like a lasso. Was Flame Whip on the scene now? The Nomu let out an ear-piercing screech that made Izuku cringe as it flapped in vain, unable to escape the flame that was now looping around in the air like a giant floating flame basket. In its struggle, The fire burned through one of its wings, with a sickening smell and a hissing sound, and the creature plummeted to the ground. Izuku was slower, letting himself drop, then levitate, then drop, then levitate, until he got close enough to feel comfortable dropping the rest of the way. There was a team of heroes piling on top of the thrashing Nomu, wrestling it into suppression bands. Endeavor seemed to be having some sort of fit, shouting Shoto's name, and it was hard to make sense of it all. Had Shoto been injured? Was he okay? Izuku was surrounded by heroes, paramedics, and the police, as he got shakily to his feet. Today, officially, sucks, he grumbled, wrapping an arm around his now very sore ribs. Did you see that? Endeavor was shouting at Onuma with a manic-looking grin. Did you see what he just did? That was beyond all of my expectations. This changes everything. What did I do? Izuku asked Ida, who was looking very shaken. Not you, Ida said. Him. He pointed over to where Shoto was standing with his hands on his knees, looking winded and scowling in his father's direction. He's the one that used that fire rope to capture the Nomu. Ida specified, sounding like his nerves were just barely hanging by a thread. We just found out that the third Nomu was taken down on the other side of town, Onuma said, putting his phone in his pocket. It's all cleanup work from here. Only a few minutes later, Izuku found himself in the middle of a group of heroes, and police all standing guard as the 3 UA interns got their wounds looked at by a paramedic. Damn, kid, the uniformed medic said as he looked at Izuku's unwrapped head. Your ear's just barely attached to your head. It's like a scalpel was used on it. What? Izuku asked automatically, reaching up to check the veracity of the statement. Don't touch it! I'm gonna carefully put it where it should go and wrap it up tight. Doctors can fix you up with some stitches, I'm sure. Izuku didn't like the way that the man's cheerful attitude didn't match the worried expression on his face. Still, he sat stiffly while his head was tightly wrapped. Shoto and Ida were nearby, also being treated for their injuries. It seems like Ida had the worst out of all of them, with a knife wound that went straight through his shoulder and out the other side, an arm with several puncture wounds from where Stain had kicked him repeatedly with his spiked boots, and another through the back of his hand that had exited his palm through his glove from a dagger. Izuku wasn't sure if they'd given him some sort of sedative or painkiller, but he was certainly much calmer now than he had been earlier. Shoto had taken 2 throwing knives in his left forearm that he had pulled out himself during their fight with Stain. Izuku wondered if they had happened at the time Shoto had claimed that he'd been nicked, after Izuku dodged. Izuku didn't know if he could have been that calm about having 2 knives buried in his arm, but Shoto's face was passive as they checked and rewrapped his arm. Izuku, besides his ear, had a few scratches and scrapes, and definitely a few bruises, but it came out of it miraculously in one piece. His ribs hurt from the Nomu slamming him into the building, and his arm and shoulder hurt like hell, but it could have been so much worse. Endeavor was dealing with the authorities and the press, and Izuku wondered what happened next. They had taken the bullet train to get to Hosu. Would those who didn't need to go to the hospital, or couldn't in his case, get back the same way? As if in answer to his question, the beating sound of a helicopter drew nearer. Izuku assumed that it was just a news station reporting on the situation in Hosu. This was bound to be news all over Japan. Instead, it landed on a patch of road intersection where traffic had been cleared for it. Of all the people that Izuku might expect to see emerging from it, the last one would have been Gran Torino. Yet, there he was, Cape being buffeted around by the winds created by the propeller above. He made his way over, carrying his walking stick to where the students were being treated, and waved. "Thank you for your services," he shouted loudly at the paramedics. "I'll be taking the boys from here." Endeavour had made his way over by then, and Izuku expected him to intervene, but instead he nodded in greeting. "All the arrangements are made?" he asked Gran. "Everything's in order, Todoroki," he said. "The location's been sent to your phone." Then he turned and looked at Izuku and said, "What are you waiting for, kid? Hurry and get in before someone dies around here. We'll be lucky if you get out of here without a new quirk or 3. Izuku didn't need a second prompt and scuttled to the helicopter, climbing inside and buckling into a seat near the window. He'd never flown in a helicopter before, so that was something at least. It did send a sense of urgency through him that he probably should have been feeling all along, though, and he waved to his classmates to join him. Shoto didn't hesitate and grabbed Ida's uninjured arm to drag him along, even as he was bowing to the medics in thanks. Before long, they were airborne and heading away from the city into the night. "Where are we going?" Izuku shouted over the noise. Gran only hesitated a moment before saying, "Recovery Girl is waiting for you at my tower." "Why not the school?" Ida asked, raising his voice as well. "'Cause we know that Kurogiri and Shigaraki can find him there," Gran said, gesturing to Izuku. "Those Nomu seem to belong to Shigaraki, and if those two are around, Izuku shouldn't be." Everyone fell silent at that. Todoroki was staring at his left hand as if he'd never seen it before, and Ida looked like he might be praying, with his hands clasped together and his head bowed. Izuku leaned his head back and closed his eyes as they flew, letting the rhythmic white noise of the copter lull him into an uneasy sleep. Izuku was jarred by a cold hand tapping his cheek lightly, and blinked blearily awake. Out of the window was the roof of Might Tower, opposite the brightly lit, iconic globe that rested on top of it. Izuku had run laps around this roof enough times to know that there was plenty of room for a helicopter to land, and nodded to Todoroki, who had woken him. "All Might and Sir have sent the interns out on patrol," Gran told them all as the helicopter set down. "Those kids have no idea you're going to be here, and we're gonna keep it that way." He hopped out of the aircraft when the door slid open and strode toward the elevator that would take them to the private elevator. Izuku lifted a hand to the ID pad, and nearly leaned in for the retinal scan when he realized that normal students wouldn't have access to a pro hero's private residence, or know how to use the security protocols. He stepped aside, hoping no one had noticed, and let Gran do the honors. They travelled down 4 floors before the doors slid open again, revealing a lobby area, and doors that seemed to lead to different conference rooms. Toward the end of the corridor, there was a room with the double doors open, and a faint haze of smoke drifting out into the hall. Izuku knew what that meant. "Crap! You called my dad!" he said. Gran snorted, like there was a choice. Ida and Shoto said nothing as Izuku picked up his pace and hurried forwards. If his dad was smoking that bad, he was imagining the worst possible scenario and getting worked up about it. Sure enough, the window on the far side of the room had a vent window open, and Izuku found his father smoking from his mouth and nose like a chimney, tapping his foot impatiently. Once he caught sight of his son, he lunged, pulling him into a tight hug that had Izuku patting his back comfortingly. "The hero killer and Nomu at the same time?" his father practically shouted, holding Izuku at arm's length to look at him. "More like one right after the other," Izuku said sheepishly. "That man was supposed to keep you safe. That's the only reason we agreed to let you go there." "I am safe, Dad," Izuku insisted, leading his father back toward the window so the smoke alarms didn't sound. "I had backup and communicated and listened to directions. Look, I'm fine." His father raked his hands through his hair and blew out a stream of smoke, obviously trying to get a grip of his emotions. "Let her be the judge of that," he said finally, pointing to where Recovery Girl was gently extracting Ida from what was left of his upper armor. "I will," Izuku said. "Ida's injuries are more important right now. Let her do what she needs to do. I can wait a few minutes." "Izuku, your head is wrapped in bandages," his father pointed out slowly, as if Izuku was brain-addled. "Oh, yeah, that's just because my ear got sliced pretty bad," Izuku explained, trying to make it sound like it was no big deal. "You know how hard it is to get anything to stick on me. They had to use a lot of bandages, 'cause it kept sliding off." His father looked as if this was at least a reasonable explanation and calmed a little. "You look like the Invisible Man." Izuku smiled at the joke, knowing that it was his father's way of coping. "Maybe I should try wrapping up Hagakure sometime." "If Midoriya was a few centimeters taller, I'd swear you were twins from across the room," Shoto said, studying their interaction. Izuku nodded knowingly. Everyone said that. Izuku made the introductions between his father and his classmates. It was a good distraction as Recovery Girl prodded Ida into one of the 3 beds that was set up in the room, with a conference table and chairs pushed to the other side. She gave Ida multiple kisses on his forehead, and he was asleep almost instantly. She turned to Izuku, then. His dad helped him peel away his costume and heard him hiss at the sight of whatever bruises he had. "What on earth have you been up to?" he asked. It was a good sign that his smoking had mostly stopped, though. "Some of that might be from training too," Izuku said, meaning to sound reassuring. "They beat you up in training?" his father said indignantly. Izuku couldn't help but laugh. "What do you think training is, Dad? We fight and try out new stuff and learn new moves. Of course we'll get banged up. There's no super awesome Recovery Girl there to heal us up either." The woman in question was busily unwrapping Izuku's head, but she did nod in agreement. It was then that Izuku nearly panicked at what his dad would do if he saw the condition his ear was in. "You know, Dad, I'm dying of thirst. Is there any way you could see if there's a water cooler on this floor?" Gran made a sudden, very unhelpful, appearance at that point, holding bottles of water for everyone. Izuku sighed. "There was a healer at the agency," Shoto suddenly said, drawing their attention. "Then why does Izuku look like he was stuffed into a giant rock tumbler?" Izuku's dad said. "'Cause Doc can only heal burns," Shoto supplied, eyes flicking over to where Recovery Girl was inspecting Izuku's very sore ear. "And he does it with his own mucus." "Dear gods," Recovery Girl muttered as she quickly held Izuku's ear in place and kissed his temple. "His mucus?" Izuku heard his dad say in disbelief, as he bent down to let Recovery Girl clean up the dried blood in the shell of his reattached ear. "Gross." "Really gross," Shoto agreed. Izuku shot Shoto a grateful smile for keeping his father from seeing just how bad the wound on his ear had been. "He blows his nose in a handkerchief, then gets it wet and smears it on," Izuku explained, wanting to keep his father from further freaking out. "They let him practice such an unsanitary quirk on other people?" Recovery Girl demanded, sounding outraged. "I don't know," Izuku said. "I didn't know what the treatment was when he did it on me, but it sure did make my burn better." That seemed like the wrong thing to say, because that set his father off on another rant. "You got burned too? What is that man thinking? Letting people shoot fire at high school students." "He's been shooting it at me since I was 4. Shoto said unhelpfully. Izuku wasn't sure whose side Shoto was on at this point, and sighed. He was beginning to feel tired anyway. He didn't argue when Recovery Girl gave him some UA pajamas and shoved him toward the bed beside Ida's. "That's even worse," Izuku heard his dad saying. That's when his dad's mumbling started, and Izuku took comfort in the fact that his father was past his worry and had moved on to righteous indignation for the time being. He tugged on the pajama bottoms and slid into bed shirtless, relaxing into the pillows with a sigh. "That ear was cut with something incredibly sharp, which was very lucky. You might have a bit of a scar where your skin is knitted together, but the cut by your eye looks like it's going to leave a mark," Recovery Girl told him quietly. "Nothing too noticeable, but I do wish you'd be more careful with your face." She gently touched the faint scar from when he was in the train wreck, the day his mother died. He hadn't really thought about that scar in years. It was just a part of his face and nothing worth thinking about. He nodded his understanding, and watched as she turned to Shoto to treat his arm. Once he was also ensconced in a bed, she disposed of the bandages and gathered her bag. "Stay out of trouble for a few days, will you?" she told them all. Ida replied with a faint snuffle in his sleep, and Izuku and Todoroki merely looked at her as if to say, "Trouble finds us." After she left, Izuku's dad shuffled his feet and finally said, "I guess there's nothing for me to do here, unless you want me to stay." Izuku felt a little bad for telling him to go home when his father so clearly was looking for an excuse to hang around, but he did it. He was sure they would all be sleeping through the rest of the night, and probably well into the next day. Gran said he'd escort them out and told Izuku and Todoroki to stay put. "There's a toilet down the hall, and one of the sidekicks will be wandering around in case of trouble. Don't try to go anywhere else." Izuku agreed around a huge yawn, and Shoto simply nodded. It had been a long day, and all Izuku wanted was to put it behind him. Once Gran left, pulling the doors closed behind him, the only light was from an exit sign above the door, and city lights on the other side of the windows. Izuku closed his eyes, intending to sleep, until he heard Shoto attempting to get comfortable. "Your dad has a fire quirk?" Shoto asked into the quiet. "He can breathe fire, but it gives him heartburn," Izuku answered. "Mostly it's just smoke that erupts when he gets upset. You used your fire. It was pretty amazing." Was the answer. "You pretty much saved my life. Thanks," Izuku told him. I'm still thinking about if I want to really use my fire," Todoroki confessed quietly. "But I'm glad I could help." After that, the room stayed silent, and everyone slept. Thank you so much for watching this video. I appreciate all the support you've given me. Stain and then Anomu. When will Izuku catch a break? It was amazing that Shoto used his fire to save Izuku when in trouble. It was truly heroic. All credits go to the original creator of this fanfiction. A is for Amy71 on AO3. I would highly appreciate it if you gave this video a like and you subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to be notified of when I next upload. There is no pressure to do so though. Thank you for visiting my cozy corner of the internet. Keep growing my sunflowers. Mwah.